The United States Coast Guard, one of our most critical defenses against illegal smuggling, border threats, and maritime disasters. A branch built on discipline, strategy, and strength. But under Admiral Linda Fagan's leadership, it all started to fall apart. Recruitment collapsed, equipment projects failed, the border was ignored. And instead of fixing these crises, Fagan focused on something else entirely: DEI policies. On his very first day back in office, President Trump did what had to be done. He fired her. This is the story of how one woman prioritized woke ideology over national security, failed at every level of leadership, and proved why Trump was absolutely right to remove her. Let's break it all down. Linda Fagan's rise to Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard was historic, but not because of her qualifications. She was the first woman to ever lead the branch, or any branch of the U.S. military. And that, more than anything else, seemed to be the reason she was given the job. From the moment she took office, her focus wasn't on strengthening the Coast Guard, it was on pushing a DEI agenda. She wasted no time prioritizing diversity initiatives over operational effectiveness, forcing officers to attend training sessions about equity, instead of ensuring they were prepared for real-world missions. But beyond the woke policies, Fagan also lacked the leadership credentials needed to command a military branch. Unlike past Coast Guard commandants who had extensive operational experience, leading major missions, enforcing maritime law, and dealing directly with border security, Fagan came from a background of logistics and personnel management. Her role before becoming commandant: she was vice commandant, yes, but her focus was on administrative tasks, not high-stakes military operations. She had never commanded a major fleet or led a high-risk combat scenario. And yet, she was placed in charge of tens of thousands of Coast Guard personnel during a time of increasing border crises and national security threats. So, what was the result of putting an unqualified DEI-focused bureaucrat at the top of the Coast Guard? The answer was predictable. Failure at every level. And it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Recruitment and retention collapsed. The U.S. military as a whole has faced recruitment struggles in recent years, but under Fagan's command, the Coast Guard suffered one of its worst declines. The service fell 4,800 members short of its needed personnel, failing to meet its recruitment targets for 4 consecutive years. This wasn't just a small setback, it was a crisis that left vital operations understaffed and weakened America's ability to secure its maritime borders. But instead of addressing this urgent problem head-on, Fagan's leadership focused elsewhere. Under her tenure, the Coast Guard ramped up diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, programs that prioritize social ideology over military effectiveness. Training focused on sexual orientation and gender identity inclusivity programs, while recruitment failures continued to mount. While other branches scrambled to address their recruiting woes with aggressive outreach and retention bonuses, Fagan let the problem fester. By the time she was removed, the Coast Guard was rendered completely incapable of responding to major threats at sea. The border crisis was ignored. One of the Coast Guard's most critical responsibilities is securing America's maritime borders, intercepting illegal drugs, human trafficking operations, and foreign threats before they reach U.S. shores. But under Admiral Linda Fagan's leadership, the Coast Guard failed spectacularly in this mission. During her tenure, the Coast Guard missed record-breaking levels of drug smuggling, including over 25,000 pounds of fentanyl that poured into the United States in 2023 alone, enough to kill millions of Americans. Instead of increasing patrols and expanding interdiction efforts, Fagan's Coast Guard reduced operations along key smuggling routes, giving cartels free rein to move their deadly products into the country. The failures didn't stop with drugs. Illegal immigration via maritime routes surged, with Cuban and Haitian migrants arriving in record numbers. The Coast Guard was caught flat-footed, struggling to intercept overloaded vessels and stop human trafficking operations before they reached American soil. Despite these growing threats, Fagan prioritized political messaging over real solutions. Instead of sounding the alarm and demanding resources, she pushed climate change initiatives as the Coast Guard's new priorities, ignoring the immediate danger at sea. Major equipment failures went unaddressed. A strong military force is only as effective as the equipment it operates. But under Admiral Linda Fagan's leadership, the Coast Guard fell into one of its worst states of disrepair in decades. Key modernization projects stalled, essential upgrades were delayed, and the service's most critical assets were left outdated and unreliable. One of the Coast Guard's most urgent needs was new icebreakers, vessels essential for patrolling the Arctic and Antarctic regions, where Russian and Chinese military activity has increased. The Coast Guard's current fleet of only 2 aging icebreakers was already insufficient. Yet under Fagan, progress on new vessels stalled for years due to mismanagement and a failure to secure funding. While adversaries strengthened their Arctic presence, America's ability to respond remained embarrassingly weak. Helicopter readiness was another disaster. The Coast Guard relies heavily on its MH-65 Dolphin helicopters for search and rescue, drug interdiction, and border patrol missions. But under Fagan, maintenance backlogs piled up, and operational availability dropped below 50%, leaving units without enough aircraft to carry out critical missions. Rather than demanding accountability for these failures, Fagan's leadership allowed these projects to remain bogged down in bureaucratic inefficiency. By the time she was fired, the Coast Guard was less prepared, less equipped, and less capable of fulfilling its mission than ever before. Perhaps the most damning failure of Admiral Linda Fagan's tenure wasn't just incompetence. It was a full-scale cover-up of one of the Coast Guard's darkest scandals. Operation Fouled Anchor was an internal investigation into decades of sexual assault at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, spanning from 1988 to 2006. The findings were horrifying. Dozens of cases of sexual misconduct had been reported, yet little to no action was taken to hold perpetrators accountable. Survivors were ignored, careers were derailed, and the institution meant to train America's maritime leaders had allowed a culture of silence to fester. But instead of addressing these revelations with honesty and accountability, Fagan's leadership actively worked to bury the scandal. The investigation was completed in 2020, yet the public, and even members of Congress, weren't informed until 2023. For 3 years the Coast Guard hid the truth, allowing those responsible to escape scrutiny. When the truth finally surfaced, Fagan was grilled by lawmakers on Capitol Hill, but she refused to take meaningful action. No high-ranking officials were held accountable, no reforms were immediately implemented, and no real answers were given to the victims who had suffered under the Academy's watch. Because of Linda Fagan, there's been a total erosion of trust between the Coast Guard, Congress, and the American public. At a time when the Coast Guard was collapsing under these crises, Admiral Linda Fagan made her top priority crystal clear: diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. Instead of focusing on fixing operational failures, securing American waters, and strengthening military readiness, Fagan led the charge on DEI initiatives that had nothing to do with protecting the country. Under her leadership, the Coast Guard launched mandatory DEI training, racial and gender sensitivity programs, and leadership seminars on unconscious bias. While Coast Guard recruiters struggled to fill ranks, Fagan emphasized expanding racial and gender diversity quotas, rather than simply recruiting the best and most capable individuals. Job postings and training materials were rewritten to highlight inclusion efforts rather than the actual demands of the job. But the most egregious example of her misplaced priorities? A $1.6 million program dedicated to hiring more DEI officers, bureaucratic positions that did nothing to enhance Coast Guard operations, but instead enforced ideological compliance across the ranks. Meanwhile, drug smuggling operations went unchecked, migrant vessels flooded U.S. waters, and Coast Guard readiness hit historic lows. President Trump saw the problem and took action. He made it clear from day one that his administration would prioritize military strength and national security over political agendas. Within hours of retaking office, he fired Linda Fagan, a decision that sent a clear message: the U.S. military exists to protect Americans, not to serve as a laboratory for social experiments. Fagan's leadership was defined by misplaced priorities, institutional failures, and blatant incompetence. Instead of addressing the crises that weakened the Coast Guard, she doubled down on an ideological agenda that had no place in military leadership. And that's why Trump was absolutely right to fire her. The firing of Admiral Linda Fagan was a wake-up call, a reminder of what happens when political ideology is placed above military readiness. But one firing isn't enough. We need to ensure that this never happens again. That means holding military leadership accountable, prioritizing strength over social experiments, and demanding that every branch of the U.S. Armed Forces remains focused on its mission: defending America. If we let DEI-driven leadership take hold again, we risk losing everything: our security, our military dominance, and ultimately, our nation's ability to defend itself. President Trump took the first step by removing Linda Fagan. Now it's up to us to keep pushing for real leadership in the U.S. military. If you believe America's military should be focused on strength, not social agendas, make sure to share this video with a friend who doesn't believe in Trump's leadership. And let us know in the comments below. Do you think Trump made the right call by firing Fagan?